Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you hear and listen to our video. This is Fritz Edlinger speaking from International, in German, international international magazine published in Austria. Today it's January the 2nd, and it's a pleasure to welcome our interview partner for today, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, on the other side of the ocean. Hello.
Great to be with you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. And we will continue the topic, what we started already yesterday this year with the interview or a statement about the South African move to the International Court about Israel's war in Gaza. And today we will change a little bit, not the issue, but the aspect where we come from. Professor Sachs, by the way, he published yesterday a long statement about with the title "Saving Israel by Ending Its War in Gaza." It was published, among others, in Common Dreams yesterday. But even before, you started already with a very, not very long, but very strong statement in the Security Council of the United Nations on 20th November, where you presented, even among other issues, also a peace program or suggestions for going to peace for Palestine, Israel. And a few weeks after, you presented in writing this peace plan for Israel-Palestine. It was formally published on November 30th. So before I make a long speech, could you summarize your main proposals, how to deal with this long conflict? By the way, it's the long unsolved conflict in younger history, because it started already immediately after the Second World War, and it's still unsolved, and the world is listening and watching, but doing nothing. So what are your proposals?
It's just to say that this conflict, in a way, started 100 years ago. It started after World War I. Britain, in its typical way, promised this land to several different groups, all in typical British cynicism, including a Jewish homeland, an Arab state, promised to the French a mandate, you name it. But basically, we've been, since the end of World War I and the end of the Ottoman Empire, on the question, what is to happen with this land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And in 1947 and 48, the UN, which just got formed, had the idea of a partition between a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. And Israel accepted it. The Palestinian and Arab side said it wasn't a fair deal. A war ensued when Israel unilaterally declared its independence. Israel won that war, and a state of Israel was established, but no state of Palestine was established. Then in 1967, with the June 1967 war, Israel took military control over the Palestinian territories as well, meaning East Jerusalem, the West Bank territory, and Gaza. And we've been in that situation since 1967, where Israel has military control over the three areas of what would be Palestine. Now, international law, as reflected in the UN Security Council and UN General Assembly for basically 57 years, has said there needs to be two states living in peace side by side. I agree with that, certainly. And international law says that should be along the borders of the 4th of June, 1967. And I agree with that proposition as well. But starting in the early 1970s, Israel began to settle in the conquered territories. It claimed East Jerusalem for its own country, essentially annexing it, saying that a unified Jerusalem is permanent, and it put hundreds of thousands of settlers, or allowed hundreds of thousands of settlers, or a combination of the two, into the occupied West Bank, and some into Gaza, though the situation in Gaza is more complicated. But essentially, Israel settled in the occupied territories. And the idea from the secular point of view was make a two-state solution impossible, basically, other than one that Israel would control or dominate. But what happened starting in the 1970s is that these settlers got a mind of their own, and these are, to a very significant extent, religious zealots, not all of them, but many of them, who say, well, God gave us all this land. We have the right to permanently dominate the Palestinian people. This is a view that I think most of the world would not accept, and the secular world would not accept. But it is a big part of the problem now, because over time, this zealous religious movement, an extreme nationalist movement that says all of this land is for the Jews, became the dominant part of Israeli politics. So what's happening in Gaza right now is not a war on Hamas to limit the danger from Hamas, which is actually much more limited than Israel claims. But it is actually a war on the Palestinian people and on the idea of an independent state of Palestine, because this government in Israel, and a large part of the population now, says no, there will be one state, it will be Israel, we will control everything. But the whole rest of the world doesn't agree with that. And they shouldn't agree with that. We need two states living side by side in accordance with international law. And my own view is that religious zealotry, based on a 6th century BC text of the Bible, should not dominate. What we need is what the international community has said for more than half a century is right: two states living side by side. And I advocate that the UN Security Council should impose that solution. Now, it should vote today, as far as I'm concerned, for an independent, sovereign state of Palestine based on the 4th June 1967 borders. And let's get on with it. Now, there's two obstacles. One is Israel, obviously, and its politics. The other is the United States. Israel has one backer in this present situation, which is the U.S. This is complicated because the U.S. political system and public do not buy into the greater Israel idea. They buy into a safe and secure Israel. But the U.S. has always supported the two-state solution. But politically, the U.S. is the backer that arms Israel, that is enabling Israel, that is actually complicit with Israel in carrying out this massacre in Gaza and this basically this ethnic cleansing operation in Gaza. And my very specific recommendation is the United States should say to Israel, look, you know, we don't agree with you, and we're not going to arm you for this purpose. Because if the U.S. stops the military support for Israel, Israel can't do this an extra day. not even an extra day. And so there is a way for this war to stop, very practically. There is a political outcome. And that's what I think we should move to.
You mentioned, I think, the vast majority of the UN member states share and they support it. And the problem is that the real power at the UN, in the UN system, is just with the Security Council. And as long as the Security Council has one, sometimes a second, maybe even with Britain, it was also because Britain is the source of the problem, because this was their colonial power. But how to move there? I think let's become precise. I think you presented really a plan with point 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I assume that many people know it, but please give a short view what the main points of your plan. It starts with the full membership of Palestine to the UN, a full membership, because as an observer they have been already, but full membership is something else. Could you just summarize your proposals?
So my basic idea is we don't need more process. We don't need more 10 years of negotiation. We don't need another Oslo process. There's no way to say more about this issue than has been said for the last 50 years. We have to understand that the two parties cannot solve this by themselves. Each one is locked into its own extremism, and there's zero trust between the two sides, to say the least. So in this case, we have an international community that is essentially united on this with one crucial footnote, which is the United States has blocked this approach for decades, even though it is, quote, in favor of this approach. Even Biden said a couple of weeks ago, we support the two-state solution. But the United States political system has given essentially a blank check to Israel for decades, so that it murmurs support for the two-state solution, but it does not enforce it. American politicians have long believed for decades that support for Israel is vital for their political health, because they have believed that that's where the big campaign contributions come from. That's in line with the military-industrial complex system, which is politically quite powerful. And they believe that's where public opinion is. But in the U.S., public opinion has turned against Israel because the American people do not want to be complicit in this massacre. And they are not supportive of the so-called Greater Israel, which means Israel dominance over Palestine. They are supportive of two states. Every opinion survey for decades has demonstrated this. That's true of American Jews, by the way, not just of the American public generally. We're not so far from that because the Security Council is basically 13 to 1 to 1. That is 13 countries support what I'm saying. One opposes it, the United States, and one always goes along with the U.S. That's the UK. Shame on them. First of all, they should grow up. Second, they should recognize they're no longer a world empire. And third, they should take some responsibility for the mess that they left. So, but aside from that, that's a footnote as far as I'm concerned. The real story here is the U.S. And I'm trying to say to U.S. public officials, look, you're completely alone supporting something you don't even support. So you have to do something more creative. Now, unfortunately, President Biden's not creative. He lacks the energy and insight. His foreign policy team is extremely weak. So I don't know whether we'll get there or not. But the domestic politics and the international politics is all pushing in the same direction. Now, what would it mean? To my mind, instead of a new political process, it starts with the outcome. 2 states, 1967 borders. Now let's implement that. Second stage, obviously, would be that on that basis, there would be a regional agreement. The Arab states would say, we end our state of belligerence or hostility with Israel. We normalize relations. We stop supporting Hamas or other anti-Israel militia groups. We stop funding them. We start arming them. We stop giving political backing to them. That can happen. Why do I say it can happen? Because the Arab and Islamic countries have said so repeatedly. And they said it recently in Riyadh when they met in an emergency meeting after October 7 and the subsequent Israeli invasion of Gaza. So that's the second step, is the diplomatic political step. That includes Iran, by the way, because it's not only the Arab states, it's also Iran, which is, of course, a backer of Hezbollah and Hamas. But that's possible, too. But we have to also stop the hostility to Iran, which was agreed with the JCPOA agreement several years ago. And then the United States broke that. And by the way, broke it in part because of Israeli pressure. So, this was Israel pushing the U.S. to break an agreement signed with Iran. And Europe, as usual, was pitiful. It just stood by and mumbled because European leaders are afraid of the United States instead of telling the United States the truth. So this is another part of it. But anyway, second step is normalizing the diplomatic relations based on the 2 states. Third step is actually putting in peacekeepers. And the best that I've heard is that this peacekeeping force, which would operate under the mandate of the UN Security Council, would include Americans, would include troops that are drawn from the Arab countries. And the idea would be to create a buffer zone that would protect Israel from incursions like occurred on October 7. And on the basis of this political solution, would also demobilize the armed side of Hamas step by step, and would show basically that Hamas, which is a political, a military, and a cultural force, the military side would be ended as part of a political settlement. And this would be the next step. The step after that would be actually to promote economic recovery and development after this devastation. There's a lot to be said about this. It's tragic and a measure of human stupidity that in a world that needs so much, the first thing we do is destroy and then have to spend huge amounts simply to rebuild what we destroyed in a matter of days or weeks. But there is a reality now that Israel has destroyed the habitability of Gaza. Oh my God. Well, we're going to have to address this. And so this is another reality that needs to be added to the scene. But my basic point is move to a solution, not to an illusion, not to the status quo, not to what Israel wants right now, which is not to talk about the day after, because we know what Israel wants the day after. They murmur it every few days, which is complete control, which is absolutely unacceptable. Not to talk about, oh, we need to reestablish the Palestinian National Authority, blah, 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 because this is all fake. What we need to do is spell out where the solution is. two states, international law, living side by side, and with peacekeepers, and disarming the threats to both sides. And this is a very practical set of steps that could be reached. And I think it's not impossible. There are big issues, by the way, that I don't have an answer to. There are hundreds of thousands of Israelis who would be dead set against what I'm saying. They are settling illegally in the West Bank, many of them based on a religious fervor that they think comes from the book of Joshua from the 6th century BC. We're going to have to address this. Addressing it in human terms may mean addressing it gradually over a few years, not violently and brutally. These are human beings, in my view, completely misguided and illegal in their actions, but that needs to be addressed too. So I don't want to pretend, obviously, that I have a step-by-step solution to everything. But the point is, we've got to stop faking what's going on right now. The answer has been known for decades, but Israel has become more and more radical. And this is very sad. It's become more and more messianic in its politics. This is weird for the 21st century, but it's actually happened. So I want us to look straightforwardly, clearly at what's going on and understand this is not normal debate about security and so forth. This is about whether there's going to be peace and two states, or whether there's going to be an Israeli attempt to dominate millions of Palestinians, or brutally suppress them, or brutally ethnically cleanse them, or kill a lot of them. And to my mind, the only possible alternative, and the one that the whole world agrees to, is to give political self-determination to Palestine. By the way, there was a vote on that in the General Assembly recently, quite interesting. Every country in the world that voted yes, except for four. The four were Israel, the United States, Micronesia, country of 113,000 people last time I checked, and Nauru, a country of 12,000 people. So basically, the whole world has said, get on with it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, there was another resolution a few weeks before where, including my own country, there were 10 and there were two European countries, Austria and Czech Republic, who strongly sided Israel. They are the most radical two EU countries on the side of Israel. But your plan is convincing. Your plan is, I think, many ideas have been already said years before, but how to overcome the real blockade. So I think you mentioned it. There is the US. We started 2 days ago an important, politically important election year in the United States. So how do you create this miracle? Because even the possible alternative to Biden is Trump or somebody from the Republican. They are in certain aspects even more radical pro-Israeli than the Democrats. How to overcome this tiny problem?
Yeah, so the pressure has to come from inside the United States and from outside. From inside, public opinion absolutely does not accept the administration line on this. This is very clear in opinion survey after opinion survey. So somebody in the White House concerned about Biden's reelection must be reading this and must be understanding this is just purely bad tactics from a U.S. political point of view. That's very important. There's lots of protest in the United States and lots of unhappiness with this. So we're not in any way locked in internally to the politics. It's bad for Biden. It's bad for U.S. interests. It's against public opinion. And so this is one point that I would make. It's not like the United States is rousing support. Yes, and it's impossible to turn. It's actually deeply contested and mainly opposed. Though I acknowledge that in Washington, the pro-Israel lobby has always been very powerful. The military-industrial complex is very powerful. And the inertia is also powerful. So I'm not saying it's easy. Now, on the outside, the entire world is basically aligned on this side with one important footnote, which is that a few European countries maybe are not aligned. I don't know what the Austrian government's real position is. Sometimes it's don't side with the U.S., or maybe it really is because of more right-wing view or whatever, side with Israel, but it's very few. The problem in Europe is European politicians stop telling the truth about almost anything years ago because all they want to do is side with the United States. And I think I would just say to European politicians, if you do it, you lose at the polls. There isn't a popular government in Europe right now because it's incredible. This is so much against Europe's own political interests. So I would say, think through this honestly and then say, it's right. We're not against Israel. We just need to move to a two-state solution. And the United States, come over here, buddy. You know it too. Let's move to a real solution. I'm waiting for European politicians to regain 2 feet on the ground, their head out of the clouds or out of U.S. control, and just state clearly, straightforwardly what is right and also what happens to be in Europe's interest. But by the way, what happens to be in Israel's interest as well, because nothing that's happening is doing anything other than gravely threatening Israel's long-term survival. This messianism, this greater Israel idea, this zealotry of this religious group, this is not saving Israel. This is threatening Israel's survival. So I want European leaders just to think clearly and honestly about this, because that'll also help the United States get to the right place.
I think there is a lot to say about the European leaders. I think the European leaders, there are no leaders, you know it better. And there is another tiny problem. We will have also an election this year in some European countries, but in the European Union for the European Parliament. And the problem is that everybody, according to most of the polls, it's to foresee that the right-wing European nationalistic right-wing parties will win. And the problem is they are even, at least concerning Israel, they are also in the meantime, also many of their parties, if to go back history, you know where they come from. And this is a historic cynicism. I think that these right-wing fascist parties now, they are on side of Israel, which is unbelievable for anybody who knows history and who knows how things happened, that these parties who are sometimes in internal issues, they are racistic, they are fascistoid right today, but when it comes to Israel, they are supporting the Jewish state.
Yeah, supporting the Jewish state is one thing. Supporting what is called Greater Israel to dominate the Palestinians is so senseless for Israel and for Europe that everybody should take a deep breath and understand that. How many self-wounds does Europe want? How many crises, how many wars does Europe want around it? And I would ask the European leaders, the reason why the right is growing is in part because the so-called center or center-left all was gung-ho with the United States for NATO enlargement and for the war in Ukraine. And of course, it's been a disaster for Europe. It's been a disaster economically for Europe. It's been a disaster from a security point of view for Europe. So it's not even left-right. It's a failure policy that the current European governments have pursued, and they are opening up their way for an opposition to arise. And that's what's happening, in fact. So the reason European politicians, by the way, across the board, you look at the approval ratings in Western Europe right now or in the EU, nobody has any support, basically, except the few that stand up for themselves, like Orban or Fico or a few others. But the ones that are basically just siding with the United States in this useless Ukraine war are all in their 20% approval ratings or 25% approval ratings and so on. So the main point I would say to Europe is, if you go the way, not of supporting Israel, that's one thing, but supporting Greater Israel for ethnic cleansing and for this terrible thing, all you're doing is making another prolonged disaster on Europe's borders. And if that's in Europe's interest, boy, please explain it to me.
This is no doubt about it. I think Europe, with this policy they follow the last tens of years, I think it's against their own security, economic, even cultural interests. I think this is something which...
I'll give you another example, by the way. The politics of the 2010s was dominated by the Syrian refugees. And anyone that knows even the slightest history should understand that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and a few others decided they would overthrow the Syrian government in 2011, typical regime change operation. That's what created the war and the refugees. Did any single European leader say that, explain that to the public? Not one. So then they wonder, why is their popularity so low? Well, if you don't speak up the truth, what do you expect? And so understand that these hegemonic wars of the United States, these are not in Europe's interests. And that's the same with supporting what Israel is doing in Gaza. It's not a matter of right or left. It's a matter of what's Europe's interest right now. It is not to have a fulminant Middle East war right now. And so European politicians should think about how to diffuse a Mideast-wide war.
You are completely right. I think you convince people like me. Unfortunately, we are not in power. And but coming back to the issue of this interview, I think now there is a peace plan. It's even economically, we didn't even mention it, but which is interesting for me, since you're also long experienced in economy. I think one important but not so much debated proposal is the establishment of a new UN fund. A UN Reconstruction and Sustainable Development Fund, which is interesting, should at least partially funded by reduction of expenses which traditionally have been spent for armament and war.
You know, outside the UN across the street from headquarters is what they call Isaiah's Wall, which is the inscription of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 2, verse 4, which says they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations will not make war on other nations, neither will they teach war anymore. I'm paraphrasing, but, you know, Isaiah had the idea in the 8th century BCE of the transforming the military to the civilian use. And we're now spending $2.5 trillion a year worldwide on the military. The United States is around 40% of the world's spending. Shocking, because we're 4% of the world's population. What if we take even 10% of that would be $200 billion a year. So $250 billion a year. And so that's the proposal. Create a fund funded by basically agreed cutbacks in armaments. I should mention that Pope Paul VI, in his encyclical Populorum Progressio in 1967, had that idea. So I don't want to claim any precedence to this, but I do think it's the right idea. The UN in general does not command much in financial resources. It needs to have a bigger budget to do good things. And one way would be military cutbacks that are rechanneled to sustainable development.
We could continue hours and hours and hours, since many things have been already discussed for many years. But it's interesting that now this plan is here. I think, do you have any ideas how to make it even more popular? Do you intend to present it to other international bodies? And how should this come to reality?
I'm discussing these ideas with UN diplomats all the time. And I've discussed it with Palestinian diplomats and with diplomats from around the Middle East. There's a lot of resonance with this. I personally am continuing to urge an immediate membership of Palestine in the UN as a UN member state. By the way, Palestine is a state recognized by 140 other states, but it is not recognized as a UN member state, only an observer, as you rightly pointed out. So I am continuing my own discussion of this, basically with the U.S. government. They don't talk to me too much, but I try to make my views known publicly by writing and posting articles all the time. And I'm writing to politicians in the U.S. who are quite resistant in general, because their modus operandi for decades has been never show any space at all with Israel. But I'm telling them it's not working. It's not working from any point of view. You need to rethink this. So they have a few days of rethinking before the Congress comes back. The White House cannot be very comfortable. We hear lots of stories about pretty harsh talks between the U.S. and Israel right now. I believe that that's true. One of the U.S. carrier groups has been withdrawn from the Eastern Mediterranean and is on its way back to the U.S. That is a signal that the U.S. does not want a wider war in the Middle East. I think that's absolutely right. The U.S. is exhausted of war, and an election year, it would be the end of Biden's chances at all. So this is the time for pushing the politics, because it's a case where the right thing to do, the politically expedient thing to do, are the same. And so I'm going to continue to push hard on that.
Do you have any hope in, I think you mentioned it and everybody knows it, I think 2/3 of the international states are in favor of this kind of political and economic solution. Unfortunately, they don't have any veto at the UN. But there is something else. There is an increasing number of states working together. I think, and the South African move to the International Court is interesting because South Africa, on the other side, is one of the leading member states of this newly established group, the BRICS group. And they have even already established a kind of new banking system, financing system. Do you have any indications or ideas that from this side, more than just political statements will come to support your suggestions?
Well, the BRICS countries, all of them are on the same side that I've been advocating. China, Russia, South Africa, India has expressed also some clarity on this. Brazil, certainly. And now you have new BRIC states that have just joined: Egypt, Ethiopia, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. It's a powerful group. They're all on this side. Actually, it's interesting for me, the fact that Iran is now a BRICS member is actually going to moderate Iran, make it part of what could be a BRICS-wide consensus on a good solution. So this matters because the U.S. also looks out and says, you know, our diplomacy, we're isolated, whereas China's and Russia's diplomacy is growing in the region. This cannot make anyone happy. And we know that in the U.S. State Department, there's a lot of unhappiness about the U.S. administration policy. We don't hear all the details, but it boils over every few weeks. And so we hear about the protests coming from inside the professional diplomatic service of the United States as well. So I wouldn't give up in any way on a political change where the United States one day says, you know, we need to move forward to a real solution here. This is where I think it's very appropriate and timely to think straight. And if the European leaders are too afraid to say it in public, they should be saying it. They should be saying it in private to their American counterparts.
They should, yeah. So I think it's time. I think we exceeded a little bit our usual limit. So thank you very much, Professor Sachs. I think it was very interesting. It's important, and I think we should really invest more and more time to publish these ideas, and maybe even outside the usual normal circles we have in New York, in Brussels, because the world is much bigger and in the long run more or less more powerful than the world which runs the business till now, but it will come to an end. And the Palestinian-Israeli issue could be, we forgot something, because the Palestinian issue, what is it in history? It's a colonial problem. It's one of the last unsolved colonial problems, and it's more than 100 years after formally colonialism was ended. It's time to deal with the remaining rests, and Israel-Palestine is one, and this should be one of our ambitions to put this forward.
Absolutely. This is right, and it makes it possible to solve also.
Thank you very much, and all the best.
To you too. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.